video should now be called Jin-to-Chi. And that's better. So the concept of Jin and Chi, I've been talking about energy for a long time, right? That's like the big thing on this channel, I guess, is that concept. Or it was at one point. There we go. Oh, it's much better. Much better. Okay, yeah, so an interesting thing happened. The thing that happened was when I was in Peru 4 years ago. Wow, 4 years ago I was in Peru. So the when I was in Peru, I met this guy called well, I won't mention his name, but this guy who's he's a Vedanta teacher, right? And he's on Facebook. We don't really talk much. I may have mentioned him in my last video. I can't remember, but he spends quite a lot of time in India. He's American, teaches Vedanta, and he regularly does fire puja. So that's like the fire ceremony. Um, and I just see him every now and then doing these fire ceremonies, and it kind of like interested me. And so I got in touch with him and asked him to teach me how to do the fire ceremony. And he like really went to town and like provided me a lot of information, put me in touch with a group in Chile where I live who are like initiated from India. And wow, a lot of information. So I got an invitation from that group to go up and do a puja with them about a month ago, and I couldn't go. It was a bad time, but the next one I will go to. They're in Santiago. It's a couple of hours drive from here. But the next one I'll go there. And it turns out, they sell all the stuff too, because there's a whole bunch of like implements which it's not necessary to use them. For example, it's quite common to do your puja in a sort of copper bowl kind of a thing. It's like a pyramidal, upside down pyramid copper bowl. Chile is famous for copper, so that's interesting. Anyway. Anyway, as I was sort of looking into this whole process of how do you do the pujas, and the people in Santiago sent me like tons of information, like really a crazy amount of information about how to do puja. But as I was going through the information, it suddenly clicked, like, dude, this is ceremonial magic. Well, I mean, maybe that's like really naive, like to not realize that, but I didn't really realize that at first, and then like I realized it, and I'm like, oh, they're just evoking deities, duh. And then my initial reaction was like, well, why bother? Because I can do that without doing a fire, But the idea of like I'd been attracted to this sort of concept. That's why I got in touch with the Vedanta teacher, right? And so I thought maybe I'll explore this a little bit. So a couple of weeks ago, I did a fire puja, right? Just by myself. And I I'm not really an expert in this yet, but there's some really sort of interesting practices with it. It's, dude, yeah, so I mean, I guess to cut a long story short, it's kind of blown my mind a little bit, the fire puja. And part of the reason it's blown my mind is, and this is not really the right phraseology here, but I'm just trying to be concise, it's this Jin-to-Chi, or the Chi to Jin connection, which you might call, normally I would just call it the physical-astral matrix, right? Or the astral-physical matrix kind of a thing. Or the astral-mental matrix, right? So it's the Jin-to-Chi is the translation from the astral to the physical, right? So saying Jin-to-Chi in a way is like saying the astral-physical matrix, right? Kind of a thing. So I was really surprised when I got no talent for fire pujas, but it was really surprising when I lit the fire up. I start getting energy from the fire, right? And of course, the thing is if you start really looking into fire puja, and just the fire element generally, And this is part of my thing, is like, one of my things has been like, I'm too focused on the astral world, right? There's too much astral. So I'm trying to balance it out, going to the physical plane, right? And so, so that's why I'm doing the fire puja, was to try and push it into the physical plane a bit more. But it was really surprising, because all of a sudden I start getting energy vibes, like a lot of energy, like boom, massive, like third eye, like opening up kind of thing, right? And that was really surprising. Now, one of the things you do in the puja is, like, for example, you can evoke a spirit, or you can evoke a deity. Like, let's say you're going to evoke Kali, for example, which is what I did, right? So for the last few months, I've been doing this sort of sadhana to Kali. And the sadhana is pretty simple. All I'm really doing is just doing like I got the Kali yantra and just meditating, just doing the Kali mantra and meditating into the yantra, right? And had a few evocations, and that's been really interesting. So I'm doing that over the fire puja, and it's like, dude, it's really powerful. And what's interesting about it is I'm not really putting much effort in. I'm not having to focus on state changes, and I'm not really having to focus too much on meditation or states of meditation. It's just sort of happening. And so it's kind of like when I learned about energy, how everything started just happening by itself. And then the fire puja, it's just happening by, I'm not really having to try to do anything. It's just working, right? It's just working by itself. And so that's interesting, you might say, right? So lots of energy. And one of the things you do with the fire puja is, for example, you feed the fire. So the fire is considered like a living entity. So you feed it. Now, what do you feed a fire? Well, you could feed it all kinds of things, right? You could feed it like a piece of wood, and that's totally cool. But one of the things they do is they'll feed it like things that humans consider like nutritious or valuable. So you might use ghee, or you might use sesame seeds, right? Or you might use and all kinds of things which might be, or you might use honey. Now, what's the intrinsic quality of honey? It's sweet, right? So if you wanted to get like a sweet result, and a lot of magic's kind of like this, is like, it's kind of just based on that sort of like, oh, I use something sweet to get a sweet result. That seems silly, right? Or you might use something like astringent if you want to do some like black magic, for example, right? I guess. I have read that, so that may be true. But all I'm really interested in is sort of exploring the space. Like, what's this? What is this? Why have I become interested in this process of fire puja? And the process of feeding the flames. So pretty much instant evocation of Kali. And something happened. Now, it didn't happen just right then. I think it started happening then, but over the course of the next week, I started sort of making contact with like another entity. And this kind of happened when, like a year or so ago, I was doing a sadhana at the Durga. And when I was doing a sadhana at the Durga, the Virgin Mary popped out. Virgin Mary popped out. Literally, I was meditating on Durga. I was doing the Durga yantra, the mantra, and I saw a light out of like the top of my head. I was lying in bed, and it turned into the Virgin Mary. And I was like, wow. Something similar happened here, but it wasn't the Virgin Mary. It was the goddess, the Greek goddess Hekate. Don't really know anything about Hekate. Certainly didn't at the time. But I've done a bit of investigation, trying to read up about it. Why is this entity coming into my field? So Hekate is quite an interesting deity. She occupies a place of interest. Some people might say it's dangerous energy, and there's certainly a lot to be said for that, because there are some people who consider, there are a lot of like black magicians who honor and venerate Hekate, right? And I'm certainly not a black magician, but on the other hand, have been involved in sort of tantric meditation for some time. Oh, and the other reason it became interesting to me was there's a magician called Jason Miller, and he's written a bunch of books. I read one of his books. I've read a couple of his books in the past. He did one on planetary magic, which was quite insightful and short, which I liked. But it was insightful and short. It was like two wonderful things, right? Anyway, I noticed he had a book on Hekate, and he also does a course. It's like a 7-month course in Hekate. And he'd been studying Tantra in Tibet. And during one of his sadhanas, Hekate had come out to say hello to him. And he didn't really know what it was about, but he decided to engage with Hekate. And that was really quite interesting to me, because he's doing a sort of tantric thing. Hekate comes out, and so he's engaged, and now he's doing and he's doing a course, which I'm probably going to do actually, just because it's interesting. It's a 7-month course, but the course is actually not so much for the Hekate content, but because he's doing it sort of based on Tibetan tantric style, which really interests me. And there's not many people teaching that, so that's probably worthwhile to do. But Hekate. So the story about Hekate is the following. This is like short version, because I don't know much about her. She's considered the goddess of plant medicine, the goddess of witches, the goddess of liminal spaces. Like, she's sort of in between the light and the dark, right? The goddess of gateways and doorways, crossroads, animals, particularly wolves and owls, and she kind of, people don't really know where she came from. There's some talk that she may be Babylonian, but she came to sort of prominence mildly in Greece, and she shows up in the Orphic hymn books, which I downloaded, and she actually does show up in the hymns, and she's known for the story about, we've all heard about the story about how Persephone, the goddess Persephone, was Hades, the god Hades, fell in love with Persephone and stole her down to the underworld, right? And then her mother or one of her parents was upset and didn't know how to get her out. And Hekate played the role in connecting, I think it's Demeter, with the sun god, and facilitating the getting Persephone out of hell, if you will. And when she came out of hell, there was a deal made, so she'd have to go back, because now she was married to Hades, but she could come out for half the year, and that became springtime, right? So it's this sort of mythological idea couched in sort of natural cycles and fertility, sort of shrouded in darkness. But Hekate was sort of key in that she was like negotiating with the light and the darkness, right? Liminal space, right? A space which, a lot of people are comfortable with the light, some people with the dark, but she was like playing in this middle space, which is quite interesting. So I think for that reason, it seems like if you do any searching on YouTube, you tend to find a lot of like witches, like all kinds of witches, good witches. They all seem to be pretty good. They all seem to be they basically just seem to be like natural magicians, right? They're working with plants and trying to be magical. And so most of these witches are using Hekate as a sort of shadow work reference. And it sort of makes sense, because the shadow work aspect is that because she can go to the underworld and come back. There's this aspect that Persephone nobody said this, but I mean, by metaphor, you might think that Persephone represents like a soul fragment, right? So if she can negotiate the return of Persephone to the world, she could negotiate some soul fragment of yours, which had been thrust into darkness, and bring that back into the spring side too, right? So I think that there's some kind of metaphor, which is maybe not mentioned explicitly, but there's something like that going on there with Hekate, which is seems reasonably interesting. Now she's also associated, like I said, she's associated with plants. There's a bunch of really quite good books about her, and the I've read a few books about her, and there's one author called Dr. Cindy Brennan, who's a witch and a doctor, but she's actually quite a good writer, and she wrote a good one about the plant medicine aspect, which is a very good book actually about sort of more common plants. I think we tend to get caught up with like master plants, like Amazonian master plants, which are serious powerhouses, as are a lot of our common plants, right? And so she's got a book about that, talking about the plants and the connection with the plants, which is very, very interesting a very, very interesting sort of genealogy kind of quote unquote there with the plants and how that works. And she's done another book too about just her other book, which I was reading, is basically a year-long program study to do. It's basically an initiation. It's an initiation into Hekate magic, basically, right? So the idea is like every day you do ceremonies, which is very much what Jason Miller is doing. He's doing like daily connections. And part of the reason you do this daily connection, very connection, is you're sort of building a mandala. You're building like an astral mandala. Kind of like you see those Tibetan guys doing with the seeds, the monks. They're making like a mandala. And the seeds just represent sort of spaces in astral spaces, right? And so that's kind of what Jason Miller and Cindy Brennan are both trying to do in their respective courses. But they're both really good books. In her book, she mentions that mugwort is the plant of, it's one of the plants of Hekate. It's the one that's most closely aligned with her, with a lot of people who practice in that zone. And so somebody in the channel has been telling me to try mugwort for a while. So I got some mugwort, and it's basically a master plant. It's sort of cool plant because like a lot of Amazonian master plants, you really have to respect the diet, whereas mugwort sort of works with you, but very powerful. You get a flow of information from the plant, and the plant's got a lot of it's a master plant. It talks. If you've done ayahuasca, if you've opened the key, it will talk to you. Generally, people talk about it for doing things like astral projection, lucid dreaming. And the first few days I was doing it, I was definitely like getting very astral meditations, like starting to meditate and instantly getting like astral stuff, like entities and stuff. So it's definitely powerful. It kind of chilled out after that. That tends to happen to me. Like when I first engage with a plant, it's very powerful for the first couple of days, and then it sort of balances out with my chemistry or whatever, and it chills. But So the whole thing about this, this whole thing, because this video is called Jin-to-Chi, right? So the reason it's called that is this whole idea of moving experimentally, not meditating less, but exploring the physical plane. Now, part of the reason for this is because I think I've mentioned this. I've certainly mentioned it in the community, but I've been doing a lot of study for the last 3 or 4 months of Sefue Mark Rasmus, who's a very advanced Tai Chi Qigong master, who is also very advanced in all of the Franz Bardon material. So all the initiation hermetics, very advanced. All the evocation, very advanced. All the key to the true Kabbalah, very advanced. And I've just learned a lot. It's a lot of it's just sort of like dotting I's and crossing T's, but he's got a lot. He's got really interesting, partly because of his connection with Qigong. He's got a really interesting way of viewing energy, its generation and its transformation and alchemy, right? So the transformation and alchemy from the physical to the astral to the mental and then up into Akasha. So essentially, it's interesting. So Jin, what it is Chi is the force which some people can feel. Like, if you've been initiated or you've become a Reiki master, you can feel energy in your hands and you can move energy and you can pass energy to other people. But in like martial arts, there's this concept of Jin, and Jin is when this Chi energy, this sort of astral sensational energy, converts into physical force. And this is like why you see some of these like funny videos where like Tai Chi masters take on UFC guys and get their asses kicked, because they think they can translate Jin, they can translate like light force into physical energy. Now I think there are some people who can do this at a very high level, but you just don't see it that much on YouTube because they're probably not trying to get a YouTube audience, right? But this idea of transposing Chi into physical energy is sort of like the inverse of the ceremonial fire, where the physical energy is transposing into Chi, right? So you get this transposition from one form into another form. And this is what Sefue Mark Rasmus calls one of the transformations. So you transform. And it's also what Franz Bardon would call the physical-astral matrix, and the sort of transformation of one form to another. So the way that Mark Rasmus does it is he might do things like he'll like feel an energy, like maybe just an energy in his hand, right? And you can feel it, especially if you're doing like Qigong, where you're like visualizing like a ball of energy in your hands, right? Maybe you're moving. Let me just try and do it right now. I don't really do Qigong. I've done Qigong in the past, but I don't really do it like as a practice. So I'm just going to move this here. I got a ball of energy in the hand, so I can feel the energy, right? You feel the energy. Now this energy it's got sort of space in my mind. It's got space, and I'm moving it in time. So it's got space and time, right? And so the way Rasmus does it is, as he's moving it, he starts allowing his concept of time to sort of dissolve. And now he's thinking more about pure form and less about the movement, maybe, right? And so for him, letting go of time allows him to move from the physical force into the astral force. Now, I don't think about it that way, but in some ways what I do is quite similar, right? So I'll be using energy, but then what I'll do is I'll just slow down my breath a lot. And I don't think about it as slowing down time. But that's kind of what happens, because a lot of times when I'm deep in meditation, my breath goes down to like 2 breaths a minute. It's like, or 1 breath a minute. It goes really, really slow. So in a way, it's the same thing. And then when you want to move into the mental matrix, or when you want to transform into the next transformation, you would let go of space also. Right, so you let go of time and space. There's nothing there, so all you've got is pure, like, mind. Right. Now, I haven't done much experimenting with this theoretically using his concepts, but I just recognize this sort of concepts from the way I do stuff, and it seems a pretty reasonable corollary, or not corollary, a pretty reasonable analogy to like the kind of stuff that I do. And so what's interesting about this though is when you build the puja, the fire puja, you're not really doing, at least where I'm at, I'm not really doing any transformations with that. It just goes on and just boom. It's got something there already. It's connecting with my energy instantly, right? So the Jin-to-Chi connection has been formed already. And so what this means is, I spent the last 7 years working pretty much purely from the astral, mental, akashic realms, right? So when you get to akasha, it's really easy to evoke spirits. Before that, but I always sort of, I hate to say it, I always kind of thought poorly of the physical aspect of it. It just seemed a little sort of like down market. It didn't seem like it was very sophisticated to me. But that's probably just a blind spot in my own practice. So I'm just trying to, this is kind of what this whole Jin-to-Chi thing is for me, is I'm trying to just sort of equalize the physical practice out. Now, as it turns out, this is probably something I need to do in my life generally, not just with magical stuff or spiritual stuff, 'cause I don't really do magic, right? Just spiritual experience, but just generally. Like, I tend to be more creative, more imaginative, and I'm trying just generally just to get out of that and just work in the physical world, right? So that's why 3 months ago I went to the gym and got a personal trainer who's kicking my ass. I got to see him in 2 hours. Oh my God. Really, really difficult, right? Really difficult. But he's got me lifting these huge weights. I'm getting huge, which I'm not really a fan of. But the only reason I really did it was just to push myself into a space I'm not comfortable with, right? So I thought, okay, I'm going to try this out, even if it's uncomfortable, and I'm going to push myself into this physical space, right? Now, there's a couple of guys on the Bardon groups who actually use Qi in their bodybuilding process. And this probably corresponds, like a lot of the Qigong guy, or not Qigong, I think it's more of the martial artists. They talk about dropping the Qi. So like when they're about to do impacts, they'll allow the Qi to drop into their lower chakra, their lower Dantian, and that will become the sort of lever into the energy output through their hands. So some people use that. I haven't done that. I'm just getting my ass kicked at the moment. But it's an interesting aspect. Obviously, the key to doing this is to become fluid. I mean, I feel like I'm really, really fluid from the astral up, but but pulling it back into the physical seems like a really. The thing is, there are these fundamental practices which, if you aren't involved in the sort of fundamental chain of practices, it's like a really sort of weak point in your practice. Clearly, right? So, I mean, obviously, if you had been an accountant and you haven't been to college yet, it might be a problem. Similar here. You can do very advanced things, but you haven't resolved the physical issues, which may. And the thing is, it's one thing to talk about physical issues, right? But the big issue here is the correspondence, and our conflict with the astral world. So, for example, oftentimes there are conflicts with our astral, our imaginative understandings of things and how things really are, right? You ever have a problem with this? You think things are one way and they're not that way? But I thought it was that way. It's not that way. That represents potentially a disconnect between astral perception and physical perception. How does that happen? Now, at a very root level, it may just be some kind of misunderstanding, right? On a deeper level, there are ideas or there are imaginations that we might have which are actually based on emotions, or they're based on like old karma. For example, when I say old karma, what am I talking about? I'm talking about things like trauma, right? So, for example, if you've been traumatized, you may be involved in some kind of cult. That's a stupid example. What's the good example here? Maybe you can't stop smoking. It's an addiction. You're involved in addiction, right? You're involved in addiction because of trauma. And you think that... and you can't resolve the problem. So how are you going to go about doing this? And the problem is it's difficult to resolve because what you think is true doesn't correspond with reality. But there's a lot of like dense weight on this construct you've got in your mind. So how can you resolve the construct? Now, one way is to work with this Jin-to-Chi, the Jin-to-Chi, astral to physical matrix. But the other way to think of this is Hekate, because Hekate is famous because she resolved this issue with the underworld. And so when we think of the underworld, we tend to think of hell, right? It's where the demons are and where the devil is. But that's not really what the underworld is. It might be that, but it's also where ideas go to die. It's where emotions go to die. It's where trauma goes to die. It's just basically anything which doesn't make it into the light of the day, by default gets pushed. We call it the shadow, but it's the darkness is what it is. It's almost like, obviously, if something's not in the light, it's in the darkness, right? So commonly people call that the shadow. But like a goddess like Hekate might be quite adept at resolving those kinds of issues of energy that goes into the darkness, since that what she was famous for, right? So I find that quite interesting, just this whole concept of the underworld. The underworld is where ideas go to die. Resolving the conflicts between the astral-physical matrix. Physical energy, we think we understand physical energy, right? Oh, we understand that. All the spiritual skeptics will tell you this. Well, you don't believe in science, but you're using the internet. You trust that energy, right? I bet you drove to work today. You trust that energy. So we've got grasp of what we think energy is in the physical world. It certainly can't be magical. Or it's so magical that all we're actually seeing is a tiny sliver of what this manifestation actually is. This buffer between the astral and the physical world is hella interesting. It's got all kinds of interesting aspects. Now, there's a lot to be said about this. For example, some people might say to you, listen, why would you bother dealing with Hekate? Why not just deal with like Krishna or Jesus, right? Why don't you just work with those deities, right? They're all powerful. Seems like a good move, right? However, part of this too is one of the things that's been really quite interesting to me about this whole emergence of Hekate is that I've never really thought about Greek deities before. I mean, I've read the mythologies and stuff, but I've never really been interested in them magically or anything. And then all of a sudden they're really, really interesting. And in some ways, we're not really sure. Listen, we are not really sure about the genealogy or the history, if you will, of the gods of the world. We know that we had the Greek gods, and a lot of them turned into Roman gods. Then those were replaced by Jesus in some ways, right? And then there were the Nordic gods. There were all these different gods. Where are they? They're all just imagination. Are they? I tend to think they're not. You can certainly evoke Krishna and Shiva and Durga. They're all evocable. And so, what is the real genealogy of these spirits? Now, this is out there, but I think there's probably a case to be made for, like, um, I think there's a case to be made that Hekate is related to the Virgin Mary through, not through, I don't really know what it's, I just get this vibe. I'm not going to try and justify it logically, because you probably can't. I just get the vibe. Now, there are some interesting aspects of this, like, and I've read this and I forgot all about it, where I formed my opinion about this. But there is some work on this where Demeter and Artemis, there is some talk about how they may have been prototypes, like some of the qualities of the Virgin Mary may have emerged from those two deities, right? And there's certainly a lot of like, listen, there's a lot of like transplantation of like concepts from one god structure into another god structure. Now maybe that's just being done by humans, right? Because that's what historians will say. It's like, well, those, the humans imaginatively transposed over, but we don't even know what the imagination is, right? But there may be some case for that, and I think there's a pretty good case that Hekate is kind of like the shadow aspect of Demeter or the other one, and so it's a big transposition. But there is this sort of possibility that there's some kind of like relationship there. Now, you're never going to read this in a book, because the people who are writing books are just looking at the history of beliefs. They haven't actually done any meditation. They haven't meditated into it to see for themselves what might be true, right? But that's an interesting aspect. So I was very surprised upon evoking Hekate, because it's interesting. There's a guy I know who follows the channel, who's very into black magic. He's very into the dark side, and he's always going on about the dark side. And I'm always like, dude, you don't need the dark side. It's why get into the dark side? It's not necessary. But I know he follows a couple of authors. So there's a couple of like, some of you may know of the website becomealivinggod.com by E.A. Coating, he's like the most. He used to be on YouTube, but he's not on YouTube anymore. But he's like a black magician, and he does curses for people and this kind of stuff, right? But he was quite successful at one point, and he had a website, and he got a lot of like authors who were writing books, and a few of the authors were doing stuff like on necromancy and how to like evoke evil, how to evoke pure evil to smite your enemies, right? Like the guy who like got in front of you at McDonald's. Smite him. It just seems like whenever you smite your enemies, what is this? 900 BC? Right? There's got to be another way to do this. Which is generally, my view in magic, is generally most of the things that people are using magic for, you can probably do with a little bit of like